considered long ago to be an issue of accountability, whereby they were letting people get away with stuff. Did they sort of ask, well, shall we consider whether we go on forever, letting people get away with stuff and wringing our hands over how there doesn't seem to be any accountability? Was there a sort of similar issue in those days?
I think if you thanks very much. If you look at like today we have groups and committees that review legislation and review what's happening. If you look at back to the 19th century, there was a continuous stream of reports looking at a whole range of things, and the consequence of that was there was an awareness that legislation needed to evolve and changes need to be made, and that terrible things were happening. And so the legislation definitely did evolve, and it would be difficult to find fault with the legislation that was there, for example, around the workhouses, because you had compatibility of witnesses, you had all the tools you need to bring this thing to conclusion. And I think you have that, and then you have a distinction in my mind between what happens in the regulatory authorities in Dublin, so in the Poor Law Commissioners, or even with the prisons in the prison board or whatever. They make these determinations in Dublin, but translating them into the local environment is where it falls down. Because in the local environment, they think differently. There's a community. There's the men, they look after each other. They look after their backs. They watch their backs. They're very closely connected, if not, commercially, through marriage. So the communities are quite tight and quite small. And people get into these jobs that they're not qualified to get into because they have connections, or because they're recommended by somebody or whatever. So the jobs are given freely without really any scrutiny about the appropriateness of the person. So the person gets into the system, and once he's in there, if he fails, his failure is almost seen as being a failure of those who put him in there, and so the thing kind of perpetuates itself. And they really do have to do something really heinous to step back and go, okay, we've had enough. And the Clare Morris one is probably the example. So I would say that the law evolves, the thinking definitely evolved, people seeing what was happening, they responded to what was happening, but where it fails utterly is at a local level when it comes to accountability before the local courts. And bear in mind, there was no going to court in Dublin back then. You went to petty sessions for the minor stuff, and the High Court was in Castlebar and in Ballinrobe for some time as well. So there weren't appeals to Dublin. So this was, the judges, okay, some judges from outside undoubtedly came in, but it was very much a local issue.
Those workhouses should never happen in terms of the whole history of our country at that particular time and how the family was handled and so forth. So in other words, there's another bigger context for workhouses that we're asking why the law was there to deal with workhouses, but there's another context of the whole history of Ireland was put into that position.
I agree with that to a certain extent. But where I probably disagree is that I think there's an even bigger context. And that even bigger context is the fact that, and this isn't just Ireland, it's the world. And for as long as people have been writing things down and thinking, women were considered to be subordinate to men. And now that doesn't account for the males in the workhouses, but this idea of the patriarchy, the small number of men who make the laws, the small number of men who force the laws, and ideas around relationships and marriage, the purity of women, the idea that women were the property of their husband, a woman's property was her husband's property. And so I think that the gloss I would add to what you've just said is that there was this bigger thing in my mind at play everywhere. Should we have had workhouses in Ireland? I suppose like right across Europe there was poverty, and poverty wasn't an Irish thing. Poverty in England was, as bad as it was here. The workhouses in England and the poverty in England was as bad. There was poverty in France and Spain, elsewhere. And the workhouses were one way of dealing with that. It was a community response. What was the alternative to the workhouses? The population was exploding. poverty was inevitable. There would have had to have been some system to look after the poor, even in wealthy societies, even in the society we have today, which is very wealthy. We have a lot of people who are struggling to survive. So I think the workhouses, the things that happened in workhouses, I think that the workhouses could have been called anything else. I think the fact that they were there and the abuses happened in them, those abuses were happening in prisons, they were happening in charter schools, they were happening across a whole range of different public institutions in Ireland and in Britain and elsewhere.
I think it's fair to say it was granted in this country was absolutely paltry compared to the amount that was allowed elsewhere in the UK. And that in actual fact, come middle of 1847, it was decided off this famine and over, it's no longer needed. So, the resources were not being focused in the right direction.
No, I completely agree with that. And I have seen some of the published numbers on the amount of money that was put into relief from Ireland, and it's disgracefully, shockingly low. But again, and it kind of goes back to the comment I made in the last question. That's the way it was, and but that doesn't, in my mind, you don't raise that as being a reason why people are sexually abused and people are physically abused, because that's two more steps in the direction. You can have terrible workhouses where people are dying of disease and people are starving, and people are starving in the countryside. But there's this extra little bit where not only is the person not taking care of these vulnerable people, but somebody seeks to exploit them for their own gratification. And I think that is, I think, in my mind, is something that's completely apart from all of the stuff around the famine. It's like the abuse of the 20th century. It's a different thing, and you cannot, in my mind, justify that in any way by saying, well, there wasn't outdoor relief, so there was loads of people in the workhouse. That is true, but in my mind, it's still.
I wasn't justifying it. I was just thinking that because of our history of segregation, we ended up in that situation.
Yeah.
Of course, that's the only thing.
Yeah. No, I understand the point you were making.
I think it was a part of it.
Sorry, Al.
So, may I ask, when did the nationalists gain influence in the poor law boards in the Mayo workhouses you've looked at? Because there's a hint in your from Farragher that he was a nationalist.
I would put Catholic before nationalist in the sense that we see around the time of the famine, we see a number of things happening. We see lobbying from the Sisters of Mercy and from the church to get into the workhouse. Because all these institutions, there was a statute behind them. That statute provided for chaplains, a Protestant chaplain, a dissenting chaplain. So they started to add Catholic members of the clergy. But what happened in the famine was they were really struggling to get masters because they were dying or they were running away, as in Castlebar. And so you find Catholic applicants coming forward and they're begrudgingly allowing them to take the positions because no one else wants to do it. And you see that across other institutions where you see individuals who are Catholics getting roles, particularly women actually. But then once you get into the late 1860s, into the 1870s, you see the Catholic thing becoming more of a nationalist thing, and you start hearing the nationalist voice. But I would be, in my little ring-fenced area that I operate, I'm not a fan of the nationalists because they are not a fan of the women, and they use the women. And in the book I deal with a lady, three women actually, who the nationalists take up their causes for their own purposes. This is what the English did to our women. We wouldn't do that. Look, America, what they've done to her. Look what this Englishman has done to her. He has raped her. But if she originally had been, this woman, if she originally had been in their minds an immoral woman, they wouldn't have cared what the Englishman did to her. So I think the nationalist view on this, in my mind, is heavily tainted right up to and beyond the War of Independence. Because, again, it goes back to the point I made earlier on. This is bigger than politics. It's bigger than religion. It's men and women, in my mind, in a lot of cases.
Okay.
Oliver? Just one more.
In the first half of the 19th century, was it part of a genocide, do you think?
Oh, Oliver, that's a big question now for today. and you know my
What's
answer.
your impression?
You know my answer as a lawyer. My answer as a lawyer is no. It does not satisfy the legal test for genocide. From the perspective of historians, if you look at what the program that was done by RTE about a year and a half ago, you have all the eminent historians coming out saying it doesn't satisfy the test. But the problem with this is that what was done was utterly atrocious. It was absolutely appalling. Someone suggested that what you would, because the difficulty with the genocide is the intention and proving the intention. Was there an intention here to eliminate a race of people? And one historian has suggested, and I kind of like the idea, that forget that intention. Don't look at it as genocide and murder. Look at it as manslaughter. In my view, it was classicide, if you're familiar with that concept. Classicide is where there's a determination to remove a class of people from a community or from a country. So if you look at what was happening, particularly in Castlebar and Ballinrobe, you see thousands of evictions by the Earl of the Lucan. He clears the land and he puts in grazing stock, or he puts in a smaller number of people who believes can pay the rent. These people are forced into the workhouses, they die in the workhouses, they emigrate, etc. In my mind, Lucan, now the key thing for classicide is there must be violence against people. People must die as a result. And in my mind, Lucan was a guardian. And as a guardian, Lucan knew the consequences of his act, undoubtedly. So by driving people out of their farms, or you were driving them to the workhouse and they die. So in my view, I think you're on much firmer footing if you're looking at it as classicide. And if you look at the Earl of Lucan, if you look at Roger Palmer, those two in particular, I think that they have a case to answer in that category. There was a question of witnesses giving evidence. Most of them gave their evidence in Irish. And then you had a translator in court who was not objective, was not very well qualified, and he did translation services. And then the newspapers translated them. So the accounts we're getting very often is not the words of the women. And very often, particularly, not so much in these inquiries, but more in serious criminal cases like capital crimes, you find in many of the cases that people did not get justice because of this language barrier.
This poem is not really after the famine, it's during the famine. And the heroine of this poem is a survivor. She has witnessed the deaths of parents and a sister. She's racked with guilt and shame about how she is surviving, but she is determined to live. She's clinging to threads, looking for the smallest little glimmer of hope, and then she sees it, and it gives her the courage to carry on. She's not immoral or loose, she is a young girl trying to survive. They are all gone now. An eerie silence hangs over mountain, field and stream. I kneel and pray beneath the willow, where little couch lies sleeping. Pile more stones upon the mound, where I live in dread of marauding dogs. Guilt is a heavy boulder upon my shoulders. All the seagull's eggs I swallowed, as mother gasped her last. The clams and cockles I should have shared, but didn't. Ambushed by loss, loneliness, hunger and despair, I am easy prey for the angel of death. He shall not have me. For today, from out a gloomy sky, came the wing beats I've been waiting for. The wild geese have come home, singing to me of hope, absolving me, urging me to stay alive. At moonrise, I will scale the domain wall, lie low as I walk the tree-lined avenue, weave my way cat-like through the rose garden, pluck a rose for courage. Let its perfume purify my soul. I will tap on the cellar window where he waits, with his leer, his whisky breath. Your late girl will be the greeting. I will clench my teeth against the searing pain, be cleansed by the cool September rain.